This is a story from the book Lancashire Folk Tales, which I co-authored with Jennie Bailey. The story is The Unsworth Dragon. Hund was one of the Hound clan, the hunting gas, with a lean, powerful stature, a swarthy complexion, eyes of pitch, sunken and suspicious, a long nose and heavy jowls, a perpetually mournful visage. He looked half hound himself. Fiercely independent, Hund had departed from the main settlement at Bury with a small group of followers and some sheep and cattle to form his own Hund's settlement, a day's journey to the south. They had toiled from sunrise to sunset, clearing the ground for the settlement and for pasture and crops, and then tilling the soil, planting and harvesting their wheat, barley, rye, husbanding their animals. There had been couplings between man and woman, children added to their community. Hund's woman had given him one child, a boy of 7 years. Thus they had followed the cycle of the seasons, developing their settlement for 7 years. One day, towards dusk, a stranger arrived at the settlement, a woman of exquisite beauty. She wore a belted gown with tight sleeves to the wrist, and an outer garment with shorter, looser sleeves, both ankle length, made of wool of the finest quality. To show her freedom, her copper-coloured hair was unbound and uncovered, falling to her shoulders, and she carried a long dagger at her belt. The woman asked to stay for 3 nights and was quickly made welcome. She listened attentively to the women, deftly fended off the attentions of the men, and laughed and played with the children, especially making friends with Hund's son and winning his confidence. The woman was careful always to remain in the shade, for she cast no shadow. On the 3rd day, in the gathering dusk, the woman drew Hund's son aside to a quiet place at the edge of the settlement. She took from her loose robe a bright, shiny apple, impaled upon her dagger's tip, and handed it to the boy with a gentle smile. The boy took the apple with shining eyes, for apples were out of season. He ate with relish, core and all, as the woman watched. For a moment her smile turned to malevolent glee. Her copper hair faded to ash. Her face collapsed into a cadaverous mask. Then she was gone. At the core of the apple was a tiny worm. It squirmed its way through the boy's body to the root of his spine, where it lay dormant for 5 times 7 years. By that time, Hund's son had taken over from Hund as chief of the settlement. He had Hund's hound-like countenance. He had a young son. One day the worm awoke and began to wriggle its way up Hund's son's spinal column, causing him immense torment. In agony, Hund's son rushed from the settlement into the nearby forest. There the worm worked its will on his sinews, bones and flesh, relentlessly tearing, turning, twisting, stretching, an orgasmic ecstasy of pain, until man became worm. Hun's son might soon have been missed had calamity not overtaken the settlement. A dragon burst out of the forest and began at once to devour the sheep. A young shepherd rushed forward to protect his flock, waving his crook. The serpent opened his great maw and brought it down over the boy's head and shoulders. The other shepherd saw his legs flailing as he was sucked into the worm's crop. The people poured out of the settlement with spears and axes to fight and kill the dragon, but these weapons were useless against his impenetrable hide. Many perished in the skirmish, slithering down into the creature's capacious crop. Once the worm's desire for flesh was satisfied, he withdrew into the forest, only to emerge the next day and the next. For 7 weeks of 7 long days, the dragon ravaged the land for miles around, gorging on the people as they tended the crops and animals. The dragon had a partiality for females. However vigilant a woman might be, the worm had a way of coming up upon her unawares, burrowing through the earth and bursting out behind her. A moment too late, she would turn to be transfixed by recognition before the great maw gulped her into its gullet. The dragon bore the familiar hound's face of Hun's son. One woman, more than one, was able to flee. The serpent caught her with his tail and gathered her in his coils. He crushed her till her bones cracked. Then, lifting her aloft, he let go. She fell, her eyes wide with terror, screaming and flailing, head first down the gaping gullet of Hun's son. From the worm's crop radiated the hot stench of blood and decaying flesh, the acrid reek of lost wives and daughters drifting across the fields and settlements. After 7 weeks, Hun's son staggered back into the settlement, naked and confused, with no notion of his whereabouts these long weeks. Memory of the dragon evoked such horror it was rarely spoke of, and as one generation succeeded another, the memory faded. After twice 7 generations, Hun's successor, also called Hund, was smitten by a strange malady, making him cringe with excruciating pain, like an army of ants. He screamed, crawling beneath his skin. In agony, he rushed from the settlement into the forest. The worm had returned. For 7 weeks of 7 long days, the dragon decimated the women folk all around, sucking them into his crop in the very moment they recognized the familial face of Hund, grinding them in his gizzard. The pungent odour of death from the worm's crop reached across the landscape. After that time, Hund returned to the settlement, naked and befuddled. After twice 7 generations, the dragon returned, devastating the hamlet of Hunderuth. Then again, after a further twice 7 generations. In the village of Unsworth, a young man, Thomas Unsworth, was becoming anxious about his father, Squire Thomas, who had complained of agonizing pain, like fiends with sharp fangs feasting upon his vitals. And then he had suddenly disappeared. Hearing a commotion, Thomas rushed out to find the villagers scurrying around in terror of a fierce dragon which had emerged from the forest and was gobbling up the women working in the fields before they could flee. Several knights with manors nearby donned their armour, took their lances and swords, and rode out fearlessly to face the dragon. Alas, swords and lances glanced uselessly off the worm's tough coils. The dragon swallowed the knights whole and shat out their armour. Some knights took up their petronels and harquebuses and fired at the dragon. It was futile. Even a sustained harquebusade failed to deter the beast from his feasting. Seeing the failure of the fusillade and fearing his father had been taken by the dragon, Thomas Unsworth devised a plan. He cleaned and primed his father's petronel. He loaded his long dagger into the firearm's barrel. He lit the slow burn match and clamped it onto the serpentine lever beside the flashpan. He donned his father's old black armour and belted on his sword. Thus equipped and attired, he mounted his father's faithful charger, which had seen so many a tourney, but none like this. Clicked his axe into its rest, and with the petronel held firmly against his chest, he cantered out like St. George to fight the dragon. He found the worm with the legs of 3 children slipping through his jaws. He raised his lance. He charged the dread creature at full tilt, knowing the lance would be of no avail, save to provide a diversion. At the last moment, he dropped the lance, just as the dragon lowered his head and opened his fetid, suffocating, slavering maw. With his right hand now free, Thomas pulled the serpentine lever to ignite the priming powder, bellowing, "Set a serpent to slay a serpent!" In that exultant moment, as the dagger blasted from the barrel, fatally tearing a jagged hole in the dragon's throat, Thomas looked up into his father's familiar face.